In this session, we're going to see some backdoor transaction codes for user administration. What I mean by this is, apart from SU01, which is used for user administration purposes, there are some other transaction codes that you need to take care of, because when you execute them, they are SU01, meaning when you execute those transaction codes, you go to SU01 screen and you can do user administration using those transaction codes. In this session, we're going to see some of those transaction codes. As you know, we use SU01 for performing user administration activities, such as user creation or user modification, assigning roles, etc. So, as a good security policy, SU01 should not be assigned to any user, except the user administrators and security administrators in the production system. The reason is the nature of the transaction code. Why is it a good policy? Because using SU01, you can basically, let's say, lock somebody out. You can change somebody's access by assigning some roles or removing some roles or profiles from the user master records, or you can prevent somebody from logging into the system by resetting the passwords or logging them out. So SU01 should not be assigned to anybody except the user administrators or the security administrators. Now, it is not enough to take care of SU01 in production system. Meaning, it's not enough that it doesn't. If you don't assign SU01 to people, it doesn't mean that some of those users cannot access or cannot have SU01 functionality. When I say SU01 functionality, what it means is it doesn't mean they cannot create user IDs or modify user IDs, because there are other transaction codes in the SAP system which, when you execute them, work like SU01. For example, let's say we'll see what those transaction codes are. So when you execute those transaction codes, you'll get to the SU01 screen, wherein you can do whatever you can, all those activities that you can do with SU01. Now, as a security administrator, you need to be careful in putting values in the authorization object S_T code. So, as a security administrator, you need to be careful in putting values in the authorization object S_T code, values using the value ranges or using the asterisk sign. What it means is that as a security administrator, one of your main tasks is to build roles. Now, when you build roles, when you enter the transaction codes into the role, the object S_T code automatically comes into the role, and which contains the transaction codes that you assign in the role. Now, those transaction codes that you put into the role become values for S_T code. Now, because this is S_T code is an authorization object, you can manually edit the values for this object by inserting S_T code manually into the role and then specifying whatever transaction codes you want as values for this object. Now, many times what happens is, especially when you are creating a configuration role, customizing role, many security administrators tend to give ranges. For example, they would say A star to B star, or A star to S star. So what it means is the user is going to get access to any transaction code that begins with the alphabet A till any transaction code that begins with alphabet S or whatever the upper limit is. So the problem in giving ranges is that the user will get more access than he or she would need. Some of that access could be critical to your production system. So specifying value ranges for S_T code is a very important aspect of SAP security, which as a security administrator you should avoid. Now sometimes you could say you want to give access to some configuration again. Let's say majority of the transaction codes in configuration IMG begin with the alphabet O. So in S_T code you could say O star as a value, which means that the user would get access to any transaction code that begins with O. Now it's another matter that when for every transaction code you'll need the related authorization object to work with those transaction codes properly. But the point is, when you give ranges, you at least give access to executing the transaction codes to the users. So when you give ranges, you may give more access than the user would need. Also, you could end up giving access to critical transaction codes. So you need to be very careful as far as security administrator to avoid giving ranges in the S_T code object. Now, SU01 is for working with user master records, the user administration. And the transactions OMEH, GCE1, OMDL, OMWF, all these transaction codes, when you execute them, they will look like SU01, meaning I don't really need, a user need not have access to SU01, but if he has access to OMEH, he can still get to SU01 screen. So in S_T code object, let's say in the role, in S_T code object, if I say O star, for example, I would give access to OMEH, OMDL, OMWF, OUS, all these transaction codes that begin with O to the user. And the user can work with any user ID in the SAP system, like you would work as a security administrator using SU01. So let us go and execute a couple of these transaction codes and confirm what we mean by when you execute OMEH, for example, it works like SU01. We'll see what we mean by that. Okay, let's execute a transaction code OMEH. See, it looks like SU01. For example, if you go back and execute SU01, you get user maintenance screen. Similarly, if you execute OMEH, you get a user maintenance screen. Let's say go and execute OOUS, that's another transaction code, OOUS, you go to user maintenance screen. Let's take some other example. Let's execute OPF0. You go to user maintenance screen, and then if you have proper access to the remaining authorization objects, you can go and modify the user master record for the users. So like as you see, you don't really need to have access to SU01 to work with user master records. Any of these transaction codes such as OOUS or OMEH will work like SE01. So whatever you can do with SE01, you can do with those transaction codes. So as a security administrator, when you build the roles, you need to ensure that these transaction codes like OMEH, GCE1, OMDL, these transaction codes, the users don't get access to these transaction codes by any means. So you need to be very careful in what you're doing when you're creating the role, especially when you're going to use ranges, value ranges in the object s_t code while creating the roles. So OMEH, GCE1, OMDL, OMWF, OUS, OPF0, OVZ5, OTZ1, OY27 are some of the transaction codes which are backdoor transactions for SE01. Now, depending on what version you are, you may find some other transaction codes which some more transaction codes which look like SE01. These transaction codes that you see are valid in ECC 5.0. So there are some transaction codes which are not valid in ECC 5.0, but they're valid in, let's say, Enterprise 4.7. So there are more transaction codes in the lower versions which work like SE01.